Hi.
All right, we are on record now, so everyone behave yourselves. The link to the source sheet is in the chat. Let me post. I think I have to post it again for those who weren't signed in yet. And tonight we are going to explore the connections between Yosef and Chanukah, or some of the connections. This is an often touched upon topic. The parshiot of Yosef are always read during Chanukah. Usually it's this week's parsha, Parshat Miketz, that falls on Shabbos Chanukah. It's actually quite rare for the calendar to do what it did for us this year, which is to read Shabbos Chanukah Parshat Vayeshev and not Miketz. But so it goes. And so we'll explore some of the connections. No radical chidushim this week, nothing that hasn't been said before by others, but we'll package it in a maybe slightly different way. Before we get started with the sources I prepared, does anyone have any initial thoughts on what any connections between, not specifically Parshat Miketz, but right, we think of Yosef, the Yosef story, as one continuous story that spreads over several parshiots. Does any connections that come to mind as we begin to delve into the topic? Nope. All right, so we'll jump right in. Let me share the source sheet.
I heard an example today from Rabbi Lisman, but it's on an adjacent.
Okay, and let's, oh, hi, Hannah.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Great. Happy Hanukkah. When do you go down to Tennessee?
Next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday, okay. All right, so we are exploring the connection between Yosef and Hanukkah, and we're going to begin with the Gemara in Shabbat. It's interesting, one of the questions that people ask is, why is there so little discussion of Hanukkah in the Gemara? Right? It's the only holiday we have that doesn't have its own Masechet. That's not true. There's no real Masechet for Shavuos either. But Hanukkah has no dedicated Masechet, no tractate of its own. Doesn't even have a chapter of its own. It just has a few dapim, a few pages in Masechet Shabbat, where we discuss, right, sort of tangentially. It's the parak that we say every Friday night in Kabbalat Shabbat, Bameh Madlikin, where it's talking about oils that can be used for lighting the Shabbos candles, or different fuels that can be used. And in that context, the Gemara says, well, there's slightly different rules when it comes to Nerot Chanukah, to Chanukah candles, and from there it goes into whatever discussion it has on Chanukah, spreading over a few pages, and that's really it. There's a couple other discussions elsewhere in the Talmud, right? One in Bava Kama, I believe, one of the Bavas, talking about is there any liability if one leaves their Hanukkah candle in the public domain in the street and it causes a fire. Someone bumps into it and causes a fire. And then there is some discussion based on Migdash specific about certain sacrifices that are supposed to be brought earlier in the year, but if you didn't, Hanukkah might be the cutoff point, the latest time you can bring Bikurim and some other sacrifices. And that's really the only discussion of Hanukkah
Bikurim Chanukah time
that we have. So the Gemara here, the first source that we have, talks and says, Ner shel Chanukah sheinicha lemala me'esrim ama psula. When it comes to Hanukkah candles, if you placed it above 20 amot, 20 cubits, about 30 feet, 32 feet maybe, it is pasul, it is not kosher. And the same is true when it comes to sukkah. The schach of the sukkah cannot be above 20 amot. And the same is true when it comes to mavui. So I've been trying to keep pace with the Daf Yomi, and we're now in Psachim, but we studied Eruvin for a long time. So the Mavui is the the Erev marker, the string, the wire, the doorpost marking cannot be higher than 20 amot either. So they want to know what's the source for this. How do we know that Hanukkah candles cannot be more than 20, that these things can't be higher than 20 amot? My dichtiv, the Habor Reik Ein Bo Mayim, it quotes a pasuk from last week's parsha when the brothers threw Yosef into the pit. The Torah tells us Habor Reik Ein Bo Mayim, that the pit they threw him into was empty. There was no water. So Rashi quotes the Gemara we're about to read. What does the Gemara say? What does Rashi say? It was empty. There was no water, but there were scorpions and snakes. Right? When it tells us that the pit was empty, doesn't that teach us already that there was no water? What does it mean there was no water? There was no water, but there were snakes and scorpions.
But Rabbi Kaplowitz, if there was snakes and scorpions in there, then it wasn't empty.
Right.
It was empty of water, but
good question. So you're sort of anticipating the question of the Torah Tamima. We'll get there in a second. But before we see the Torah Tamima and how he explains this whole thing, because what does an empty pit or a pit with snakes and scorpions, what does that have to do with Hanukkah? How's that a proof for anything?
And how do we know it's 20? It's 20 amot.
And how do we know 20 amot? Right? How does an empty pit teach us 20 amot? Okay, so to get there, we first have to see a little bit the discussion of sukkah. Why is it that schach of sukkah also cannot be higher than 20 amot? So down in source number 3, the Mishnah tells us sukkah shehigvar l'mala me'esrim amah psula. A sukkah that's higher. Right? When it says sukkah, it means the schach, because that's the most important part of the sukkah. So if the schach is higher than 20 amot, it is pasul, it's invalid. Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. That's a machloket we're not going to get into tonight. And then we can skip to the Gemara. Minahane mile. How do we know that the maximum height is 20 amot? Amar Rabba de Amar Kra. Lemani du dorotechem kibusu koto shavti b'nei Yisrael. When giving us the mitzvah of sukkah, the Torah tells us that it's in order that the Jewish people will know that God caused us to dwell in Sukkot when he took us out of Egypt. And it's interesting that many say that there's actually a mitzvah when it comes to Sukkah, that one has to have kavanah, that one has to have this pasuk and this symbolism of the Sukkah in mind when sitting in the Sukkah. And we have to know the Sukkah is a reminder that God caused us to dwell in Sukkot when we left Egypt. That gets into the debate, is it Sukkot Mamash, is it literal huts, or was it Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of glory? Again, we'll get more into that on the holiday of Sukkot. But so Rabbah says, from this pasuk, he says, Ad esrim ama adam yodea shehu dar b'sukkah. L'mala me esrim ama ein adam yodea shedar b'sukkah. So if the roof, which makes the sukkah, which defines the sukkah, is 20 amot or lower, then a person knows that they're dwelling in a sukkah. But if it's so high and so distanced from the person, then a person would not know that they're sitting in the sukkah. Mishum de lo shal tava ena, because he won't be visible, it won't be in a person's immediate sight line. And so if you don't see the schach, then you won't know that you're sitting in a sukkah. Or a second opinion, Rabbi Zera Amar Mehacha, the sukkah tiyel etzel yomam mechorev ad. So there's a pasuk in Yeshayahu that says the sukkah provides shade. Ad esrim ama adam yoshev b'tzel sukkah. L'mala me esrim ama ein adam yoshev b'tzel sukkah ela b'tzel defanot. So if the sukkah is defined by the shade, so only up to 20 amot would the shade that a person is sitting in be the shade of the roof. If the roof is so high, is higher than 20 amot, you wouldn't be sitting in the shade of the roof, you'd be sitting in the shade of the walls. So we have to, so the maximum is 20 amot in order that we have some awareness of some cognizance that we're sitting in a sukkah and we're not sitting, sitting somewhere else. Okay, so with that background, we can go to the Torah T'mima and I think Rena's excellent question. And Gary, he touches on your question too, how we know 20 amot. Okay, so he quotes the Gemara, the Rashi that we already saw. And remember, he says we have to remember, what's the context of the brothers throwing Yosef into the pit? Remember what happens? They see Yosef approaching, and they say, oh, the dreamer is coming. We don't like this dreamer. Let's kill him. Reuven speaks up, and he says, nope, let's not kill him. Let's put him in the pit instead. And then, right, there's a whole discussion, but then, right, they ultimately decide to sell Yosef to the Midianim or the whoever it is that's traveling by, rather than kill him. So the Torah Tamima begins by asking if the entire point of throwing Yosef into the pit was to not kill him. So why would they throw him in a pit with snakes and scorpions? That seems to be dangerous. That seems like it might defeat the purpose, right?
You can't see the snakes and scorpions if it's more than 20 hours.
Thank you, Robert. So Robert's already made the connections, okay? So 20
Really?
amot, it must be greater than 20 amot, or else they would have seen the snakes and scorpions and would not have thrown Yosef in. That's the proof. So that's scary how we know 20 amot. You know, that's how they weren't aware of the snakes and the scorpions at the beginning, okay? Right, the intention was to not kill Yosef, but right, Reuven wanted to return him to Yaakov. And he says also, if the brothers knew that there were snakes and scorpions in this pit and Yosef somehow survived, they wouldn't have so casually sold him into slavery, but they would have recognized that something great had happened. What's his proof? It says that Nebuchadnezzar, he threw in Mishael, Azariah, right? Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah, right? He threw them into the fiery furnace, and they were saved, and he recognized it was a miracle, and then he didn't do them any more harm. So, of course, the Shvatim, Yaakov's children, if they saw that such a miracle happened to Yosef, they would not have done him any harm either. Right? Don't be surprised that they couldn't see what was in the pit. The verb that is used to say that they threw Yosef into the pit is vayashlichu. They cast him, or they sent him, they threw him into the pit. It says this verb, we're told elsewhere in the Talmud, means a minimum of 20 amot. So it has to be that they threw him further than 20 amot, or else it could not have used the verb lishloach, to send him. The kan dichti vayashlichu, im ken ayabor amok me'asrim amav yoter. It must have been at least 20 amot deep, or more deep. The kaimalan de lemala me'asrim ama ina ino shel adam sholetet kemo de kaimalan le'inya ner Chanukah v'sukkah. And we've already established when it comes to Chanukah, to Sukkah, to the Mavui, to the Erev, that a person doesn't see what's more than 20 amot higher, or I guess lower also from where they are. Then he adds in parentheses, and this is sort of the point for us. Yesh lechavein lefi zeh smichut v'shaychut rasha zu begemara im hadin ner Chanukah. Right? What does this teaching of Yosef and the brothers in the pit have to do with Chanukah? Okay, it's very nice that Yosef was thrown in the pit, but how does that serve as any proof for the halacha of Hanukkah candles that they also can't be more than 20 amot? Okay, and we can stop there. Okay, so this sort of puts the question in stronger halachic terms, or stronger lumdish terms, right? We have this teaching of the narrative Chanukah, of the Hanukkah candles, that comes from Yosef. So intrinsic in the halacha, there is some connection with Yosef in the parshiot that we're immersed in, and we're going to offer a few suggestions about what those connections might be, what Yosef has to teach us about Hanukkah on a more philosophical level as well. So to begin with, we find throughout the Yosef story, and right, this the first source, number 5, comes from our parsha, when Paro has his troubling dreams that he can't make sense of, And all of a sudden, the baker is reminded. So not the baker, the butler remembers, right? I remember my sin. I was in jail, and there was this Hebrew servant who was able to interpret my dreams and the dreams of the baker, right? So Paro sends for Yosef. I'm in source number 5 now. Vayishlach Paro vayikra et Yosef, vayaritzuhu min habor, vayigalach v'yichalef sinlotav, vayavo el Paro. So Paro sends and he calls for Yosef, and they run him from the pit. Interesting, Yosef is again in a pit, right? The jail is described here as a pit. And he shaves and he changes his clothing and he comes to Paro. Vayomer Paro el Yosef, chalom chalamti upoter enoto. V'ani shamati alecha lemor tishma chalom liftoroto. Paro tells Yosef, I've had a dream. No one can tell me its meaning. I've heard that you're able to interpret and solve dreams. Vayan Yosef et Paro lemor biladai. Yosef says, not me. Elokim ya'anet shalom Paro. God will help Paro come to peace or come to terms to understand what's going on. This isn't the only time that Yosef says that whatever power, whatever success he has comes from Hashem, right? Last week in the beginning of Yosef's ordeal in Egypt when he's sold to Potiphar, we read in source number 6, Yosef hurad Mitzrayma, Yosef was brought down to Egypt. Vayiknehu Potiphar suis Paro sar tabachim ish mitzrim yad ishmaelim asher ridu shama. Potiphar's, Paro's minister purchases Yosef. Vayhi Hashem et Yosef vayhi ish matzliach vayhi beveit adonav hamitzri. God was with Yosef and he was successful and he was in his master's home. Vayar adonav ki Hashem ito. And his master saw that God was with him. And everything he did, God caused him to succeed. Rashi there tells us, what does it mean, ki Hashem ito? How does Potiphar, an Egyptian minister, an Egyptian official, know that the success that Yosef has is because of Hashem? Rashi says, Shem Hashem, Shem Shemaim Shagor B'piv, the name of God was a familiar word in his mouth. Meaning Yosef was always talking about God, was always talking about Hashem. And finally, we have in later on in our parsha, after Yosef interprets Paro's dreams and amasses all the wealth for Paro that he amasses, Vayomer Paro el avadav, hanimsa kazeh ish asher ruach Elokim bo. Paro says to his servants, is there any person like him in whom the Spirit of God resides? Okay, so Yosef is very forthcoming with his recognition, with his allegiance to Hashem, and people recognize that. Okay, we're gonna so Yosef is easily identifiable as associated with Hashem. So that's we're gonna put that aside for 1 second. Keep that in the back of our minds. And there's another thing that we see with Yosef also. And this is a midrash that picks up on the end of last week's parsha, when Yosef successfully interprets the dream of the butler and of the baker. And Yosef says, please do me a favor. Please do me a solid. When you go back to Paro, remember me and try to help me out, right? So it's interesting, Yosef is criticized here for not having enough emunah, for not having proper faith that God is going to work everything out himself. That begs the question, well, what else was he supposed to do, and don't we have to put in our own effort? It's a really interesting question. But nonetheless, what does Yosef say when he's asking the butler to help him out? Ki im zichartani itcha ka'asher yitav lach. I'm in source number 9. Let me make sure the English is visible. When things are good for you again, please remember me. Vasita na imadi chesed, and do a kindness for me. Yizkartani el Paro, remind me or mention me to Paro, v'hotziyatani min habayit hazeh, and take me out of this jail, this dungeon. Ki gunav ganavti me eretz ha'ivrim, because I was stolen or I was taken from the land of the Hebrews. Vegampo lo asiti me'uma. And here also in Egypt, I did nothing wrong. Kisamo tivabor, they have put me in the dungeon. Okay, so the Midrash picks up on this, because Kuni alludes to the Midrash, but we'll just see the source inside in number 11. The Midrash comes from Devarim Rabbah, and the Midrash is contrasting Yosef and Moshe. And remember, throughout the entire book of Devarim, Moshe has one request of Hashem. What's Moshe's request of Hashem?
That he'd be allowed to enter the land of Israel.
He'd be allowed to enter the land of Israel. And that request is denied several times.
Mm-hmm.
So the Midrash gives an explanation, a rationale for why Moshe is denied entry into the land. And in the Midrash's telling of this explanation, Moshe puts the question as follows: Amar Rabbi Levi Amar Lefanav. So Moshe says to Hashem, Ribono shel olam, atmotav shel Yosef nichnesu la'aretz, va'ani eini nichnas la'aretz. Yosef's bones are going to be taken into the land. And we know that Yosef was temporarily buried in Egypt throughout the entire duration of Bnei Israel's servitude. But when they left, they carried Atzmot Yosef. They carried Yosef's bones with him, right? So Yosef is going to be merited, merit to be buried in Israel, and I won't be. Marlo Kadosh Baruch Hu. So what's God's explanation to Moshe for why Yosef is ultimately buried in Eretz Yisrael and Moshe is not? Misha hoda ba'artzo nikbar ba'artzo. Misha lo hoda ba'artzo eno nikbar ba'artzo. Whoever there's no recognized or admits his land will be buried in the land, and whoever did not recognize or admit his land will not be buried in the land. What does this mean? What does it mean that Yosef recognized or admitted his land? So he was identified by Eshet Potiphar, by Potiphar's wife, as follows: Ruhe vilanu ish ivri. Right, when she frames Yosef, when Yosef denied her advances, and she frames him and says that he was trying to rape her, to attack her, she says, "Look, they brought a Hebrew servant here, the lo kafar. He does not deny her identifying him as a Hebrew servant. Ella, rather, he accepts that identity, as we saw in our pasuk, gunav gunavti me eretz ha'ivrim. I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. Yosef identifies himself as a Hebrew. So he merits to be buried in the land. At the end of Sefer Yoshua, it tells us that one of the first things Yoshua does is they bury Yosef in Shechem, which was his portion in the land. Now God turns to Moshe. You, Shelo hodeita b'artzecha, ein ata nikbar b'artzecha. You did not recognize, you did not admit to your land, therefore you can't be buried there. What's this talking about? When Moshe rescues Benot Yitro, the daughters of Yitro, from the other Midianite shepherds, they tell their father, Ish mitzri hitzilanu mi'ad haroim. They say, an Egyptian man saved us from the shepherds. Hu shomea v'shotek. And he didn't correct them. He accepts their identifying him as an Egyptian. He doesn't correct them. And therefore, God says, you are not able to be buried in the land. Right? So we could ask, is this a fair critique of Moshe? Rena does not think it's a fair critique of Moshe.
No, Yosef lived in Israel for the first 17 years of his life. Moshe was never there. I mean, he is a descendant of people who lived there, but he himself was raised in the palace among Egyptian nobility. Yeah. So it's not a fair comparison. It's not fair.
No. But nonetheless, that is what the Midrash envisions God telling Moshe. What does this have to do with Chanukah? So remember, we saw two things about Yosef. We saw that Yosef was someone who was very comfortable talking about Hashem and telling others about Hashem and raising awareness of Hashem. And we see that Yosef was someone who, at least in the Midrash, is praised for for accepting his connection, his identity as an Ivri, as a Hebrew, with a strong allegiance and connection to the land of Israel. What does this have to do with Chanukah? Turn to source number 12. The Rambam tells us when it comes to Chanukah, Mitzvat ner Chanukah mitzvah chaviva hi ad me'od. The mitzvah of lighting Chanukah candles is a very precious, a very dear mitzvah. Tzarich adam lihizaher ba kedei lahodia, and a person must be very diligent in performing it. Kedei lahodia hanes, in order to make the miracle known, v'losif b'shevach hakel v'hodaya lo, and to add to the praise of God and giving thanks to Him, al hanisim she'asa lanu, for the miracles that God has done for us. Afilu ein lo ma yochal ela min hatzdaka, even if a person has nothing to eat, he's supported by charity. Shoel mocher kisuto v'lokeach shemen v'nero to madlik, he has to sell the clothing off his back, which might be another interesting connection to Yosef, right, where his coat was torn from him. He has to sell his clothing in order to get money to buy candles or fuel to light the Chanukah candles. Why does the Rambam go to such an extreme when it comes to Nero Chanukah? Right? Think about it. It's a mitzvah derabanan. It's a rabbinic ordinance, right? A person has to sell the clothing off their back in order to do a mitzvah derabanan. Why?
Could it be because it's something we're supposed to publicize to everybody?
Okay. Yeah, so part of it, I think, is that the mitzvah is, right, the reason we light candles is Pirsume Nisa, to publicize the miracle. And I think that the Rambam is saying very powerfully that even a poor person has to feel enough connection and enough relationship with the mitzvah to take pride and want to publicize it, and to feel empowered to publicize and state what they stand for. Right? It's right. We could also bring the halachot of where we're told that even a very poor person, has to give tzedakah. Right? Even someone who gets tzedakah from others has to give a little bit to people that are in more desperate situation than him or herself. Right? That part of what I think the Rambam is saying is that Chanukah is one of those mitzvot that is not, obviously there's the technicalities of the mitzvah, but the message is much more important. And the message here is that you have to have pride in the ability to assert your identity and assert what it is that you stand for. So even a poor person...
How literally are we to take the Rambam? We should like Hanukkah the menorah naked and preclude the possibility of going out looking for work the next day and starve and die?
Right, so I'm not sure he means naked, right? Kisuto might be in outer clothing, but the point is that you need to put yourself out there in a pretty serious way, right? A lot of people are batting around the question that the Rambam also says that if you have only enough fuel to light Hanukkah candles or Shabbos candles, you're supposed to light Shabbos candles because Shabbos candles also add the element of Shalom Bayit. So there's this sort of like halachic conundrum that if you sell your clothing, right, if you have to sell whatever in order to be able to afford candles, then you can only afford one candle. Ironically, halacha would say that you light the candle of Shabbos rather than the candle which caused you to have to sell your clothing in the first place. A little bit of an interesting paradox there. I don't know how literal the Rambam is, Gary, but I think that he does mean you need to. I don't think he means you have to be to the point of being naked, because then there's other halachot also of kavod habrios, not embarrassing yourself or embarrassing others. But he seems like a pretty strong, and I think a pretty, I take him at face value, that you have to sell basic necessities in order to do this mitzvah. Any other thoughts or questions about this? So I think so. The first possible connection with Yosef and Chanukah is that Yosef teaches us what it means to assert our identity and to assert what it is that we stand for. Yosef asserted and confirmed his belief and his recognition of Hashem, his identity as an Ivri, as a Hebrew from the land of Israel, and Chanukah forces, is our message to ourselves that we have to assert what it is that we stand for, right? The very act of publicizing a miracle, right? It takes some courage and it takes some backbone to put a menorah in your window, by your door, and to proclaim to the world, this is who I am, this is what I stand for. Right? We take for granted that we're able to do that without much repercussions, but that certainly was not the case. It's not even the case in all Jewish communities today. Certainly historically was not the case. And so I think that's one powerful connection between Yosef and Chanukah. Second connection. And this will be our final connection for tonight. Well, maybe we'll touch on some others. But a second connection. Source number 13. Beginning of this week's Parsha with Paro's dreams. Right, Paro has these dreams. Right, big question, is it one dream or two dreams? But what is the dream? Paro has a dream. He's standing by the Nile, and the cows come out, the healthy cows, and they're all grazing together. And then 7 sickly cows come out, and they eat the 7 healthy cows, and they don't get, there's no change in the appearance of the sickly cows. And then he has a second vision where he sees the sheaves of wheat. And there's beautiful ones, and then the bad ones come and they consume the beautiful ones, and everything still looks sickly. In verse 7, the unhealthy, thin sheaves swallow the healthy-looking sheaves. And Paro, Vayikatz Paro v'hinei chalom, he awakens and it was a dream. Vayiba boker, vatzipaim rucho, and in the morning he was very bothered by this. Vayishlach, vayikar et kol chartumei Mitzrayim ve'kol chachameha. He sends to all of the wise people, the sages of Egypt, and the sorcerers or the magicians. Vayisaper Paro lehem et chalomo ve'ein poter otam leparo. He tells them of his dream, and no one was able to interpret them. And so the question that I wanted to just ask for a second is, why could no one interpret these dreams? Yosef comes along. You know what he tells him it means. He tells him it means that the 7 cows, 7 healthy cows, mean 7 years of plenty, which are going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And the same with the wheat. The fact that it's repeated confirms that this is in fact what's going to happen. It seems like a pretty straightforward, logical explanation for what's going on. So how come none of the Egyptian wise men were able to come up with such an explanation to Paro?
Bad times.
What was that, Arthur?
They didn't want to tell Paro that there were bad times too.
So maybe they were afraid to tell Paro. The Midrash doesn't go that way. The Midrash in number 14 says that they did offer not so pleasant explanations of the dream, right? They say you're going to have 7 daughters. The 7 daughters are going to die. You're going to capture 7 nations, and then they're going to rise up against you. And they weren't afraid, at least according to the Midrash, they weren't afraid to tell Paro that these had bad interpretations, bad messages for him. I do agree that there might have been some reluctance to give a bad message to Paro. But at least the Midrash...
if they didn't have a connection to God like Yosef did. So how could they have possibly known what the dream meant? Because Yosef says this all comes from God.
Right.
And Paro's magicians don't have a connection with God like Yosef does.
Right. So certainly that's part of what's going on. That ties into what we just spoke about. That's what Yosef tells Paro.
I came across another answer I thought was interesting
Mm-hmm.
this week. They were sort of more literally minded. They couldn't, at first, they couldn't figure out how a sickly cow or a shriveling piece of wheat or corn could eat something really good and still look awful.
Okay.
They got hung up on that. They didn't know how those two things could coexist without the good somehow coming through. That really sounded awful to them.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I thought that
Okay.
was a pretty good one too.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I want to say something that I think is along similar lines. The way I heard it framed was that Egyptian culture was all about the here and the now, right? That they could see it as being 7 good things followed by 7, and 7 bad things, but they couldn't think of it as being a message of time, that the 7 cows represented 7 years, that everything for them was in the here and the now. And so, right, just like, so if in the here and the now, a sickly cow eats, eats a gesunter meal, then we're going to expect the cow to look better. But that they couldn't think of it as sort of a linear, a time, an elapse of time, and that was part of the issue. But the essential message I wanted to take away from it is what Nachum Sarna says in the JPS commentary. None could interpret them for Paro. It is inconceivable that the professional dream interpreters are unable to provide interpretations. The key phrase, therefore, is for Paro. That is, their solutions do not satisfy him. The fact is that there is nothing in the dreams that relates in any personal way to Paro himself. This, incidentally, is in contrast to all previous dreams in Genesis, in which the dreamer plays a central role. It is therefore clear to Paro that his dream experience has a wider national significance. The customary fawning and flattering expositions of the magicians are therefore unconvincing. This is the key point. At least what I want to take as the key point. The failure of the Egyptian professional dream interpreters has significance that reaches far beyond the immediate story. This incident, the first clash recorded in the Bible between pagan magic and the will of God, constitutes a polemic against paganism. The same motif recurs in the contest between Moshe and Aaron and the court magicians of Egypt in Exodus 7-9, the rivalry between Daniel and the magicians of Babylon in the book of Daniel, and in the story of Bilam in Bamidbar, right? What he's saying is the fact that the Egyptian sages, the Egyptian magicians, can't offer an interpretation, and Yosef can, is the first time that we see a clash of pagan philosophy versus monotheism or versus a belief in God. Right? We have many midrashim that come earlier, right? And some of us expect that the story of Avraham and the idols in his father's shop are in the Torah, but those are midrashim. He says this is the first philosophical debate that we have in any sense in the Torah, right? And so the reason perhaps that the Egyptian magicians couldn't offer an interpretation to Paro is because their worldview, their philosophy didn't allow for such an interpretation, right? To thinking, to planning for the long term, to living beyond the here and the now, whatever the case may be, or the fact that there seems to be, right, everything in the dreams begins in the Nile. The Nile is the god of Egypt. So there can't be any bad coming out of the Nile, out of the river. And so only Yosef, only an outsider, is able to see through the farce or see through the falsehood of such a worldview, of such a philosophy, in order to offer the true interpretation. And if that's the case, that Yosef is, in his interpretation of the dream, is running counter to Egyptian religious philosophical worldview, then it's a very interesting connection to Hanukkah. Because what's the Hanukkah story all about? It's about the clash of civilizations, the clash of Judaism and Hellenism. And so Yosef, in that way, perhaps prefigures or foreshadows what's to come in the Hanukkah story. That we have another clash of civilizations, clash of ideas, and that the rabbis were able to trace that back, at least in some form, to Yosef, is quite a powerful statement, which I thought was an interesting connection. Right? We could think of, and we could spend time looking at many other connections, perhaps between Yosef and Chanukah. Right? Chanukah being essentially, a holiday we celebrate the rededication of the temple, but Hanukkah in many ways is a holiday that is celebrated once there was no more Nevuah, once the temple, that it's in many ways a Galus holiday. It's in many ways a holiday of the diaspora, and that Yosef teaches us how to live in the diaspora, how to live successfully, how to maintain allegiance to Hashem, allegiance to his traditions, while successfully navigating the outside culture. Right? And Hanukkah is ultimately about not just that we put everything down, but that we have to find a way to embrace that which is good in the host cultures that we live in, while remaining true to our Jewish heritage, our Jewish halacha, our Jewish traditions. And so there's many interesting connections between Yosef and Hanukkah. If you're curious, you can do simple Google searches, and I'm sure you'll come up with many divrei Torah, many other connections that people find. But I think that these are a few of the fundamental ones. We have the Gemara at the very beginning that connects the basic halachot of the Hanukkah candles to the story of Yosef. We have the idea of publicizing and having pride in who it is that we are, what we stand for. And we have the philosophical debate, the clash between Hellenism and Judaism on the one hand, and the debate between, that at least some see in Yosef's ability to interpret the dream, to see through the falsehood of Egyptian religion and worldview, which is a foreshadowing of the same clash, the same struggle that is embodied in the Hanukkah story. Any final thoughts or reactions to what we said tonight?
I just had one more to offer that
Please.
might add to what you said. The number 7 in Paro's dream, happening twice, clearly to us means the whole natural world. I mean, that was part of the urgency of things. And Paro probably was upset that he had to reject these other interpretations, but with things that didn't seem to be relating at all to what was happening in the world around them, the natural world around them.
Right.
And so of course, Yosef represents the one who is in connection with the one who is infinite and is the creator of all. And so he represents the number 8 in a sense in there. Right. And I thought that the 7s and the 8s come back to also represent the days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, which of course is an incredibly beautiful festival of the oneness that one experiences with God. So there was one of the Pesukim I noticed that you didn't address, and that was that God was with Yosef, but it would flow also perhaps from one of the ideas that you had there.
There's that. I mean, beautiful, and there's there is a very strong tradition that pays very close attention to the numbers, and 7 and 8 are very significant. As you mentioned, that 7 generally represents nature, and 8 is the Mala Min HaTeva, is above nature, beyond nature. And so that's an interesting question about Hanukkah is obviously it's 8 defined by 8 nights. We talked the Dvar Torah that I sent out this past Shabbos talks about the significance of the 8 days, the 8 nights of Hanukkah, but 8 being above or beyond nature is a very interesting connection. And there's a very strong connection between Hanukkah and Sukkot that we're not going to get into tonight, but we can leave that as a teaser for a different time. There are very, very interesting connections there, and the numbers 7 and 8 play very strongly into that. So Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Anne. If there's no other thoughts or questions, we will say Laila Tov and have a good week.
Hanukkah to everyone.
Happy Hanukkah, good Chodesh, Chodesh Tov. Enjoy the snow or whatever we're getting tomorrow.
Yeah.
And we will see everyone again soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Right.
much for that.
Yashka.
Dessert.